He thought he'd bought nothing but dust and silence, until a rifle in the shadows made him realize this ghost town wasn't dead. It was fighting to survive. When Caleb Rourke signed the papers for a forgotten ghost town, he thought he'd bought nothing more than dust, ruins, and silence for $100. But the first thing he saw wasn't emptiness, it was smoke, a thin column curling from a chimney that should have been cold for decades. He tied off his horse, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the dry, metallic scent of the desert air, and stepped into the main street. Where weeds should have owned the earth, a stubborn little garden bloomed. Behind cracked windows, shadows moved, human shadows. And then, in the doorway of what had once been the general store, stood a woman. Her hands were weathered, but steady on the rifle she aimed his way. The morning sun cut across her face, and her eyes held the kind of steel you only see in people who fought too hard for too long. "My name's Caleb Rourke," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I bought this place from the county. Every building, every lot." "No confusion on my end," the woman replied. "You're the one who doesn't belong." Her name was Mara Whitfield, and behind her, in the dimness, Caleb caught glimpses of blankets strung up as walls, shelves lined with dented cans, and a bed shoved against the corner. It wasn't a squat. It was a home. A sound cut through the stillness, a harsh, rattling cough from deeper inside. Mara's eyes flickered toward it, and for a heartbeat, the hard edge in her face cracked. "That's my granddaughter," she said quietly. "She's sick. And this is the only roof for 100 miles that doesn't let the rain through." Caleb felt something twist in his chest. He'd come here thinking about investment, clean up the ruins, maybe open a business. He hadn't expected to find life, let alone a life on the edge of survival. And yet here she was, standing in a town he now legally owned, holding on to it with nothing but grit, a rifle, and a sick child hidden in the shadows. It was the first moment Caleb realized, maybe this ghost town wasn't abandoned at all. Maybe it was just fighting to stay alive. Caleb Rourke had barely taken in the sight of Mara Whitfield's makeshift home when the sound of hooves broke the uneasy stillness. Slow at first, then faster. 3 riders cutting through the dust like a storm rolling in. Mara stiffened, her rifle coming up without thought. "They found us," she whispered, and for the first time, Caleb saw something in her eyes that wasn't steel. It was fear. The riders came in like they owned the place. The leader was a thin man with cold eyes and a badge catching the sunlight, flanked by 2 deputies wearing smug expressions that didn't belong on anyone decent. Sheriff Clayton Voss dismounted slowly, scanning the street, the smoke, the garden. Things he clearly hadn't expected to find. "Well, well," Voss said, his voice dripping with false satisfaction. "Mara Whitfield, you've led us quite a chase." "This isn't your land anymore, Clayton," Mara shot back, stepping between him and the door. "It belongs to someone else now." Voss's eyes shifted to Caleb. "You'd be the fool who bought this worthless pile of rocks from the county." "I own it," Caleb replied, keeping his tone steady. "Legal and proper." The sheriff laughed, but it was a joyless sound. "Legal and proper? Sure. Did they tell you the land came with debts?" "Big ones. Mara here owes the bank a nice fat sum in unpaid loans. $800, last I checked." Caleb saw Mara's face go pale. "Those loans were forged. My husband never signed anything," she said, her voice tight. "Dead men don't argue," Voss sneered. "And if she can't pay, the bank has other ways of collecting. She comes with us. The child too." Caleb felt the temperature in his chest drop, replaced by something heavy and dangerous. He knew what happened to women and children in the hands of men like this. He'd seen it before in other towns, other dusty corners of the West where law was just another word for power. "No," Caleb said simply, stepping in front of Mara. Voss's deputies stiffened, hands twitching toward their guns. The air went razor sharp. "Step aside, Rourke," the sheriff said, trying to sound casual but not quite hiding the caution creeping into his voice. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Caleb answered. "They're on my land. That makes it my business." Voss took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You got any idea what you're interfering with here?" "Enlighten me," Caleb said. The sheriff spat in the dust. "Your friend's husband borrowed money, signed papers, and died without paying back a cent. The bank owns her. That's how things work here. Convenient, Caleb replied. Dead men can't dispute signatures. The deputies shifted uneasily. Even they seemed to sense the ground tilting beneath them. Show me the papers, Caleb said. What? You heard me. The loan documents. If it's real, prove it. For just a heartbeat, Voss's confidence faltered. Then the mask came back. I don't have to prove anything to you. Then you don't get to take them, Caleb said, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. The silence was so tight, you could hear the wind whisper through the broken boards of the saloon across the street. One of the deputies muttered, Sheriff, maybe we ought to— Shut up, Voss snapped, but his eyes stayed on Caleb. He studied him like a man measuring a problem he couldn't quite solve. Finally, he said, Fine. You want proof? I'll bring it tomorrow, with the bank president and a federal marshal. You can see for yourself. He turned to leave, but his voice was all teeth when he added, And when that marshal sees you interfering with the collection of a legal debt, you'll be the one in chains? Caleb didn't blink. Bring whoever you want. The sheriff smiled thinly. You have no idea what you just started? As they rode away, dust swallowing them whole, Mara's shoulders sagged, the fight in her body giving way to exhaustion. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you risk yourself for strangers? Caleb didn't answer right away. Maybe it was the pale face of the child in the back room. Maybe it was the way Mara had stood her ground with nothing but a rifle in desperation. Or maybe he was just tired of watching the powerful crush people who couldn't fight back. Because you're not alone in this, he said finally. Somewhere inside the store, the child coughed again, a sound raw enough to scrape at the edges of his resolve. Caleb knew this wasn't over. Tomorrow would bring the sheriff back, and with him, more trouble than this dying town had seen in years. But trouble was coming whether they stood still or stood together. And Caleb Rourke had already made his choice. If you felt the weight of Caleb's stand, the tension in that dusty street, and the spark of defiance in Mara's eyes, then hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this Wild West fight for justice. Your support keeps these stories alive, just like the people who refuse to be forgotten. The next morning came gray and heavy, like the sky knew what was on its way. Caleb Rourke was outside mending a broken hinge on the store's front door when a rumble of hoofbeats rose from the eastern trail. But it wasn't the sheriff. It was a small group of riders, 6 of them, armed, dusty, and moving with the deliberate purpose of people who'd had enough of running. At the front was a woman about Mara's age, her back straight as a fence post, her eyes scanning the street like she was already measuring the distance to trouble. Mara stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Ruth Henley, she said in surprise. I thought you were in Clearwater. Not anymore, Ruth replied, swinging down from her horse. Same reason you're here. Crow's little debt collection scheme. We've been looking for you. The other riders dismounted, and Caleb took in the mix. Men and women, all worn by hard miles, all carrying the same look he'd seen in Mara the day before, tired but not broken. Ruth gestured toward her people. Every one of us lost our homes to forged loans. Husbands dead or vanished, signatures faked, land stolen. 15 families we know of, maybe more. Crow and the Millfield Bank have been running this game for years. Caleb felt the pieces sliding into place. This wasn't just about Mara and her granddaughter. It was systematic, it was wrought, and it went deep. We know Crow's bringing a marshal, Ruth continued, but that man's been on the bank's payroll for years. If we want any chance at justice, we need proof. Real proof. And we think we know where to get it. Mara's grip on her rifle tightened. Where? Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. Samuel Chen, bank clerk. He's the one forging the signatures. Grew himself a conscience last week, sent word he'll testify, if we can guarantee his safety. He's hiding in the old mining camp 20 miles north, but Crow's men are hunting him too. If they find him first— She didn't need to finish. Caleb could see the risk in every angle. Splitting forces meant leaving the town vulnerable. Going after Chen meant walking straight into Crow's line of fire. And even if they brought Chen back alive, a crooked marshal might bury the truth before it saw daylight. There's another problem, Caleb said. Even with proof, what stops them from burning this place down and saying we resisted arrest? Ruth's smile was grim. Nothing. Which is why we're not just gathering evidence, we're gathering witnesses. She pointed toward the horizon. Dust clouds shimmered in the distance. Newspapermen from 3 towns, territorial investigators, even some tribal leaders from the reservation. This is going to be too big and too public to sweep under the rug. Mara's eyes narrowed. You're turning this into a spectacle. I'm turning it into a shield, Ruth corrected. The only one we've got. Inside the store, a coughing fit broke through the tense air. It was sharper, harsher than before. Mara dropped her rifle and ran in, Caleb close behind. Zara was sitting up in bed, her face flushed, eyes glassy with fever. The cough shook her small frame, and when it broke, there were flecks of blood on her lips. This is worse, Mara said, her voice low and tight. Caleb knelt beside the bed. The girl's breathing was shallow and labored, each gasp scraping at her throat. She needs a doctor, he said. Nearest one's in Millfield, Mara replied. If we go there, we won't come back. The unspoken truth hung between them. If they stayed, she might not survive the night. Before Caleb could answer, the sound of another rider approached fast. He looked out the window and froze. Sheriff Voss was back, alone, his face pale, his horse lathered with sweat. He swung down from the saddle with shaking hands. This has gone too far, he muttered. Way too far. Ruth stepped outside, hand on her revolver. What happened to your marshal, Sheriff? He's dead, Voss said, but there was a tremor in his voice. Shot on the road by Samuel Chen. Mara's eyes went wide. You're lying. Voss pulled a blood-stained badge from his coat. Found this near the body. Chen left a note, said he'd rather die fighting than hang for forgery. Caleb studied the sheriff's face. There was something there, a flicker of guilt, maybe even doubt. Whatever the truth was, Voss wasn't telling all of it. Where's Chen now? Caleb asked. Gone, Voss said. Disappeared into the mountains with enough evidence to hang half this territory, including me. The confession rippled through the gathered crowd, a mixture of shock, anger, and something darker. Inside, the coughing stopped. The silence was immediate and wrong. Mara rushed to the bed. Zara lay limp, her skin gray, her eyes rolled back. Her breathing was so faint Caleb had to press his ear to her chest to hear it at all. She's dying, Mara whispered, her voice breaking. My baby's dying. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Voss stepped into the doorway, his voice quieter than Caleb had ever heard it. There's a doctor in the tribal settlement, old medicine man. Saved folks white doctors couldn't. That's 30 miles, Ruth said sharply. 2, if you know the trails, Voss replied. And I know them. Mara looked at him like she was trying to read the truth in his eyes. Why would you help us? Voss's jaw worked. Because I have a granddaughter, too. And I'm tired of being the kind of man who lets children die for money. Outside, another sound rolled in. Many horses, fast. The bank's hired guns had arrived. The street erupted in chaos. Shots cracked through the air as the settlers and Ruth's riders took cover. Newspapermen ducked behind barrels, snapping photos between bursts of gunfire. The territorial investigator just arrived, shouted for someone to hold the line. The fight was short and brutal. When the smoke cleared, half the hired guns were wounded, the rest disarmed. And in the aftermath, the investigator stepped forward with a satchel of papers. Samuel Chen didn't kill the marshal, he announced. He saved him, and he handed over everything, enough proof to shut down the Millfield Bank for good. Caleb glanced at Voss. The sheriff's face was unreadable, but his gaze kept drifting to the store, where Mara knelt over her granddaughter. Zara's breaths were faint, ragged whispers in the air. There wasn't time for anything else. Voss looked at Caleb, then at his horse. We leave now, he said. Caleb nodded. Then let's ride. The street still stank of gunpowder when Caleb Rourke tightened the cinch on his saddle. The echoes of rifle fire hadn't yet faded from the buildings, but none of that mattered anymore. Time was bleeding out as fast as the breath from Zara Whitfield's tiny chest. Sheriff Clayton Voss stood beside his horse, jaw clenched, hands moving with practiced efficiency as he secured a crude travois they'd fashioned from blankets and two stripped saplings. "Keep her flat," he instructed Mara, his voice steady but low. "She's weak enough that every jolt could cost her." Mara lifted her granddaughter gently, as if her arms were the only thing holding the child in this world. Zara's head lolled against her shoulder, lips pale, breath shallow as wind slipping through a crack. Caleb helped settle her onto the travois, tucking another blanket over her frail body. Voss mounted up, taking the lead rope. "Stay close. We don't stop unless we have to. And we don't talk." They left the ghost town at a gallop, the horses' hooves pounding a grim rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Caleb kept pace beside Mara, his eyes flicking from the rocky trail ahead to the small bundle trailing behind Voss's horse. The sheriff knew the land like it was a part of him. He cut down narrow canyon paths and across dry creek beds where the rock was slick but solid. Twice they wove through thickets of mesquite so dense that branches clawed at their coats. Each time Caleb thought of turning back, until he looked at Mara, her face set, her hand resting protectively on the edge of the travois. Hours blurred into a single, pounding urgency. They forded a shallow river, the water icy enough to steal the breath from Caleb's lungs, and climbed a ridge where the wind howled between jagged stone pillars. By the time Voss raised his hand for them to slow, the sun had begun to drop, painting the western sky in streaks of fire. The tribal settlement appeared without warning, a scatter of low adobe homes built against the curve of a ridge, smoke curling from stone chimneys. An old man stepped out to meet them, his hair long and silver, his eyes sharp as flint. "Joseph Whitehorse," Voss said, sliding from his saddle. "She's dying." Joseph's gaze moved to the travois, taking in the child's stillness, the fever-flushed cheeks. He didn't ask questions. "Bring her," he said simply, turning toward a low building at the settlement's edge. Inside, the air smelled of sage and wood smoke. Light filtered through narrow windows, falling across shelves of clay jars, bundles of dried herbs, and tools worn smooth by decades of use. Joseph knelt beside Zara, pressing his palm to her forehead, then to her chest. His touch was gentle, but his eyes stayed locked in a silent calculation. "Pneumonia," he said at last. "But not too late. Not yet." Mara's hands trembled. "Tell me what to do." "You will sit by her," Joseph said, "and you will not leave her side." To Caleb and Voss he added, "Fetch water from the spring. Bring cedar and willow bark. I will make a decoction to ease her lungs." They worked until their hands ached. Water hauled in heavy buckets. Bark stripped, pounded, and boiled until its bitter scent filled the room. Joseph mixed herbs into a steaming clay bowl, his fingers moving with a precision that felt as old as the hills themselves. Through it all, Mara stayed beside Zara, stroking damp hair from her face, whispering stories from the time before everything was taken from them. The first night was a battle of breaths, each shallow rise of Zara's chest a victory, each long pause a silent terror. Voss sat in the corner, his badge lying on the floor beside him, turning it over and over in his hands, as though it were something poisonous he wasn't sure how to let go of. By the second day, the girl's fever broke for short stretches. She would open her eyes, murmur for water, then sink back into sleep. Joseph remained cautious, but Caleb saw the flicker of hope in his gaze. On the third morning, the first snow flurries drifted down from the mountains. Mara was half asleep in the chair when she felt a small hand brush hers. Zara's voice was faint but steady. "Grandma, I'm hungry." Mara's head dropped to the bed, tears soaking into the blanket. Caleb turned away, the knot in his throat making it hard to breathe. Even Voss seemed carved from something softer now, his eyes lowered, his hands still. That afternoon, while Joseph tended to Zara, Voss stepped outside with Caleb. The wind smelled of snow, and somewhere far off a hawk called over the ridges. "I've been a lawman 20 years, Voss said quietly. "Thought I knew what justice was. Turns out I was just collecting debts for thieves." Caleb studied him. "What are you going to do about it?" Voss reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. "Everything I know about the bank, the loans, the men who signed the orders. I'll swear to it. I'll put my own name on the line." But when this is over, I'll answer for what I've done too. Caleb took the papers. They felt heavier than their size, as if they carried the weight of every family driven from their land. Inside, Zara laughed. Soft, breathless, but alive. Mara's voice followed, warm for the first time in years. The war with the Millfield Bank wasn't over. But for the first time since he'd stepped into that ghost town, Caleb believed they might actually win. 6 months later, winter had broken into a cautious spring, and the land that once lay silent under the name of a ghost town had a new name, New Haven. Caleb Rourke stood in the middle of the street that used to be lined with sagging roofs and empty windows. Now, fresh planks gleamed in the sunlight. The ring of hammers and the laughter of children replaced the lonely moan of wind through broken boards. He'd given away most of the land he'd bought for $100, dividing it among the families who had been robbed by the Millfield Bank. All he kept was a small plot for himself, a modest ranch on the edge of town where he raised cattle and grew vegetables. Mara Whitfield ran the general store again, but this time its shelves were stocked for more than survival. Her granddaughter Zara, now with color in her cheeks and a spring in her step, was a constant presence by her side, learning to weigh flour, count coins, and greet neighbors by name. Sheriff Clayton Voss had served his time in territorial prison, his confession and testimony sealing the bank's fate. When he returned, it was not as an enforcer for the powerful, but as New Haven's sheriff, sworn to protect the people he once stood against. The Millfield Bank was gone, its stolen wealth broken apart and returned to the families it had bled dry. The crooked web of signatures and debts that had bound half the territory in chains was nothing but ash in the courthouse stove. One afternoon, Caleb leaned on the fence outside his garden, watching Zara chase a cluster of stubborn chickens while Mara bartered with a rancher for fresh eggs. The air was warm with the scent of tilled earth, and the hills wore the gold of young grass. He'd come here thinking he was buying a forgotten piece of the past. Instead, he'd found a future, one built not on deeds and paper, but on trust, shared work, and the stubborn belief that people deserved better than the world had given them. Sometimes, in the quiet between sunset and starlight, Caleb could almost hear the old town's ghosts. Not the dead, but the living dreams of people who'd refused to be erased. If this story touched you, like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale where courage and justice find their place in the Wild West. In the end, New Haven was more than a rebuilt town. It was proof that even in the harshest corners of the world, people could stand together against greed and corruption. Caleb, Mara, Zara, and Voss showed that justice isn't just about laws, it's about the choices we make when others are powerless. The lesson is simple but hard to live by. Doing what's right will cost you, but turning away costs far more. In a world quick to take, the true measure of worth is found in what we're willing to give to protect one another.